The prints came from the tree line. They crossed the yard in a straight line, and they ended at the porch steps of the Holt farmhouse. They did not lead away. That was the part that did not fit. They arrived. They did not leave. Whatever had made them had come from the north gap in the trees, crossed 60 feet of open yard in the night, reached the porch steps of a house where 3 people were sleeping, and then nothing. No prints leaving, no marks on the steps, no indication of where it had gone after it arrived. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, quiet places and things that don't quite leave, consider subscribing. There are more waiting. Jonas Holt found them on the morning of December 3rd, 1874, when he came out at first light to start the day's work, and stepped off the porch into the yard and turned back to look at the steps, the way a man sometimes turned back for no particular reason. The snow had fallen the night before, 2 inches, clean and even, the specific unbroken surface of a snowfall that had stopped before anyone was moving. The yard was white and unmarked, except for the line of prints coming from the north. He stood in the yard and looked at them. They came from the gap in the tree line at the yard's north edge, the specific gap where the 2 largest oaks framed an opening in the timber, the natural passage that anyone coming from the north drainage would have taken, and they crossed the yard's open ground in a line that bent slightly left at the midpoint, as though the thing that made them had adjusted its course, and they came to the porch and stopped. He walked the length of them without touching them. He counted. 18 full strides from the first impression at the tree line gap to the last impression at the base of the porch steps. He looked at the porch steps. Soft pine, 2 steps up to the porch level, the wood weathered and slightly soft in the way of wood that had absorbed moisture across many seasons. No marks on the steps, no marks on the porch boards above. He stood at the base of the steps and looked at the last impression in the snow, and then up at the porch, and then back at the line of prints crossing the yard. He went inside and told Clara what he had found. Jonas Holt had been farming the south end of the valley since 1861, 13 years before that December. He was 47 years old, a careful man by temperament, not given to alarm. His wife Clara was 44, and their son Will was 22, and had been working the farm alongside his father since he was old enough to carry his weight at the work. All 3 of them had been in the house the previous night. This was the first thing Jonas established when he came inside. He told Clara what he had found, and she came to the window and looked at the prints crossing the yard, and then she looked at him. "We were all here last night. All night. Did you hear anything?" She had heard nothing. The night had been the ordinary night of a winter farmhouse, the fire settling, the wind outside, the specific quiet of a family that had done its day's work and was resting from it. Will, when they woke him, said the same. He had slept through without waking. He had heard nothing. 3 people in the house, one of them a light sleeper by his own account, and nothing heard. Jonas went back outside and looked at the prints again in the better light of the risen sun. He looked at them with the attention of a man who had been reading ground his whole life, not the specialized attention of a tracker, but the ordinary literacy of a farmer who noticed what happened in his fields and yards, and who understood that the ground kept a record if you knew how to read it. The prints were human in their general character. The impression was the right size and shape for a booted foot, the rounded toe, the defined heel, the ball of the foot between. He crouched beside one of the clearer impressions in the yard's center and looked at it carefully. The impression was fresh, not the degraded edges of a print that had gone through a freeze-thaw cycle. Fresh, the crystal structure at the edges sharp, the depression clean. Whatever had made this print had made it after the snow stopped falling, which was sometime around midnight by Jonas's reckoning. He stood beside the impression and took a step of his own to measure the stride. His stride covered about 2 feet. The prints in the snow were spaced at closer to 2.5 feet. Not dramatically longer, not the stride of something moving at a run or a bound. The stride of something walking at a walking pace, but longer in the leg than he was. He looked at the tree-line gap. He looked at the porch. 18 strides. Something had taken 18 strides in the night and arrived at his front door. He went inside to wait for Elias Cord, and he sat at the table, and he thought about the fact that something had been in his yard last night, taking 18 measured strides toward his door, while he and Clara and Will were asleep inside, and that he had not heard it and did not know what it was and had no way of knowing whether it had stood at the porch steps for a moment or an hour before the morning made it invisible. He sent Will to the Cord farm before breakfast. The Cord place was a half-mile north, the nearest neighbor, and Elias Cord came back with Will before the morning was an hour old. Elias was 53, a man who had been in the valley for 20 years and who had the quality that Jonas needed that morning. He was practical and unhurried, and he looked at things before he said anything about them. He looked at the prints. He walked the full length of them, the way Jonas had, and he crouched at several points and examined individual impressions. He stood at the tree-line gap where the prints began and looked south across the yard toward the house. He stood at the base of the porch steps where the prints ended and looked north across the yard toward the trees. He stood there for a while. Then he went around to the back of the house and looked at the snow there. Unmarked. He checked the east side and the west side of the house. Unmarked. He walked the perimeter of the yard at a distance of 20 feet, looking at the snow beyond the prints line for any indication of a return path, any impression that the snow might have partially obscured, any compression that might indicate a track through the undisturbed surface. He found nothing. He came back to the front and stood with Jonas at the porch steps. No return. No. Jonas looked at the tree line. Nothing anywhere around the house. Steps show nothing. And the porch boards. Elias put his boot on the lowest step and pressed down. The soft pine gave slightly, the way soft pine gave when weight was applied to it. He lifted his boot and looked at the impression it had left in the weathered wood. Clear as could be. He looked at the porch boards, unmarked. He said nothing for a moment. Then, the stride. I noticed. 2.5 feet, maybe more on a few. Jonas said, taller than either of us. Or longer in the leg. Elias stepped back from the porch. Not necessarily taller. Could be a long-legged person of ordinary height. It looks like a person. Elias looked at the prints. He looked at them for a long time. The shape is right for a boot, he said finally. The heel definition. The toe. He crouched one more time at the nearest impression. Could be a person. The hedge in that answer was what Jonas had been thinking about since he found the prints. Could be, rather than is. He had been saying is to himself, trying it, and finding that it sat wrong in the same way that it sat wrong in Elias's mouth just now. Whatever it is, Jonas said, it came from the tree line, and it came here, and it didn't leave. Elias stood. That's what the snow says. Clara Holt made her own examination of the prints that morning after Elias had gone home. She was a practical woman who had been on this farm for 13 years and who knew its yard the way she knew all the spaces she moved through daily, with the automatic knowledge of repeated transit. the knowledge that included not just the layout, but the character of the space. She walked the line of prints from north to south, without crouching and without the analytical attention the men had brought. She was reading them the way you read a familiar space, looking not at each impression individually, but at the line as a whole, the way a sentence was understood, not word by word, but as a thing with direction and meaning. She came back to the porch and stood on the lowest step and looked north across the yard at the tree line. Will was beside her. He had been quiet all morning, the quietness of a young man trying to decide what he thought about something. They knew where they were going, she said. What do you mean? A person would wander crossing that yard at night. The dark changes your direction. You'd drift. She pointed at the slight leftward curve at the midpoint. That adjustment is course correction. That's something that knew it had moved offline and corrected back. In the dark, without a visible landmark. Will looked at the prints. A person would know to correct. Yes, she said. A person would know. That's what I mean. Whatever made these was navigating. It had a destination and it was tracking its progress toward it. She paused. In the dark, across an unfamiliar yard. How do you know it's unfamiliar? She thought about that. I don't, she said. Maybe I don't. She went back inside and did not say more about it that day. But that evening, when the family sat at the table after the meal, she put down her fork and said, I want to look at the tree line gap. They went the following morning, all three of them. They walked north from the porch, following the prints without stepping on them, and came to the gap in the tree line where the first impression began. They stood in the gap and looked south at the house. The house was centered in the gap's frame. Not approximately centered, the way a subject was centered when you had positioned yourself deliberately. The gap framed the house and specifically framed the front door, and the prints ran from this gap straight to that door, with the slight correction at the midpoint that Clara had identified. Will stood in the gap for a long moment. It was looking at the door, he said. No one answered him. They stood in the gap for a while, and then they walked back to the house, and none of them looked back at the gap, and the morning continued. Clara did not revise her assessment that it had been navigating, but she also did not repeat the word unfamiliar. She had said it too quickly. She did not know the word was wrong. She suspected it might be. The Hollow heard about the prints from Will, who told Elias Cord's son at the mill 3 days later, and from there the accounts spread in the way that accounts spread in a small valley, through the practical transaction of people who shared information because sharing it was the sensible thing to do when the information was about something that might matter. Several people came to see. What they found was what Jonas had found, preserved by the cold. The line of prints crossing the yard, the tree line gap at the north end, the porch steps at the south end. The snow had not been disturbed further. No new weather, no additional tracks in the vicinity of the original line. The prints were as they had been found. Margaret Webb, who was the most direct person in the Hollow on most matters, looked at the prints and the porch and said, "Something came here and didn't leave." Elias Cord, who had said nothing publicly beyond his initial examination, said, "That's what the snow says." What else would the snow say? Nothing else. He looked at the tree line. That's the whole account. Old Pratt, who had been in the valley longer than most and who had seen most things the valley had produced across 30 years, walked the line of prints slowly and said nothing at all until he reached the porch steps. He pressed his hand against the soft pine of the lowest step. He stood and looked at the yard. "Anyone in the house last night?" he asked Jonas. All three of us, all night. Heard nothing. Nothing. Pratt nodded once and walked back toward his farm without further comment. He was a man who did what his assessment required, and when his assessment required silence, he provided that instead. The others examined the prints, compared their own stride lengths to the impressions, confirmed the 2.5-foot spacing, confirmed the absence of any return path in any direction around the house, confirmed the unmarked porch steps and porch boards, and then stood in the yard in the December cold and held the account that the evidence produced. Thomas Webb, who was Margaret's husband and who had the specific practical intelligence of a man who built things for a living and who thought in terms of mechanisms, said, "An animal, walking on its hind legs, a bear." Elias said, "Walk beside the impression." Thomas put his boot beside the nearest impression. The impression was longer than his boot. Not dramatically, but measurably. Perhaps an inch at the heel end and half an inch at the toe. He moved his boot alongside several impressions and found the same result each time. "Too long for a bear's hind print," Elias said. "And bears don't correct course, not like Clara described." "What did Clara describe?" Elias told him. Thomas looked at the midpoint of the track where the slight leftward curve indicated the course correction Clara had identified. He walked to the midpoint and stood there and looked south, toward the house, and then north toward the gap. "A person corrects course," he said. "Yes." "So it's a person." Elias said nothing. Thomas looked at the porch. "A person who didn't leave," he said quietly. "That's what the snow says." Thomas stood at the porch steps a while, looking at the unmarked wood. He did not know how to make something useful out of what he was looking at. He went home. He did not offer the bear theory again. Margaret stayed a while longer. She stood in the yard between the porch and the tree line, and she looked at the line of prints, and she looked at the gap, and she looked at the porch, and she thought about the course correction. She thought about all the things she crossed her yard to reach: the well, the barn, the gate, the garden in season. She thought about how she navigated those crossings, by landmark, by habit, by the accumulated knowledge of a space she had moved through thousands of times. She thought about doing it in the dark. She thought, "This yard is not my yard. This yard belongs to the Holts. If I were crossing this yard in the dark, I would drift." She looked at the midpoint correction. Whatever had crossed this yard had not drifted. She went home and told Thomas she thought they should check on the Holts regularly through the winter. He said, "I was going to say the same thing." Neither of them said why they both felt this way. They did not need to. The hollow as a whole reached a similar unspoken consensus. People found reasons to pass the Holt farm more often in December than they had before. Elias Cord came by once a week. Margaret Webb sent food with her children on Saturdays. Old Pratt made an unusual number of trips down the South Road in the evenings, taking the long way past the Holt yard, looking at the house as he passed. None of them said they were keeping watch. None of them would have used that word. But the frequency of visits increased in December, and everyone knew why, and no one mentioned it, and the Holts received it with the grace of people who understood what their neighbors were doing without requiring it to be stated. The hollow spent the winter with the account of the Holt prince in the way it spent any difficult account, present to it, not obsessed by it, returning to it in the gaps between the ordinary work of the season. The prints were discussed at the gatherings that winter, with the specific care of people who understood they were talking about something that did not have a comfortable conclusion, and who had decided, collectively, that discomfort was acceptable as long as honesty was maintained. The honest account was, Something had crossed the Holt yard in the night and come to the porch and not gone back. The snow said so. The snow was a reliable record. What had made the prints was not established. Nathan Cord, Elias's son, went to the Holt farm on a January afternoon and walked the prints, still preserved in the frozen surface, though degraded slightly at the edges from the weeks since the snowfall, and came back with an additional observation. He was a careful young man who had been reading the valley's ground alongside his father since childhood, and he had noticed something the others had not noted. "The depth varies," he said. Elias looked at him. "The impressions aren't all the same depth. The ones in the middle of the yard are deeper than the ones near the tree line or near the porch." He showed his notes, small pencil marks on a scrap of paper. "The middle impressions are pressed about half an inch deeper into the snow than the end ones." Elias was quiet for a moment. "The snow depth changes across the yard." I checked. Even depth across the whole yard. Same conditions throughout. Nathan paused. Whatever made the middle impressions was pressing harder on the ground at the midpoint, or moving faster there, or something else. He stopped. "Or heavier there," Elias finished. They sat with this. A person walking across 60 feet of flat ground did not vary in weight across the traverse. Their stride might vary with hesitation or acceleration, but their mass did not change. A thing that was pressing harder into the snow at the midpoint of a crossing than at either end was doing something that the mechanics of walking did not account for. Oh, neither of them said this out loud. There was no useful conclusion to draw that either of them trusted enough to state. They noted it as an observation. Nathan wrote it down and Elias committed it to memory, and they added it to the account and left the conclusion where it was, which was in the middle of the yard, pressing slightly deeper than it should have been, halfway between the trees and the door. Margaret Webb, in one of the later conversations, said, "The part I keep coming back to is the gap in the trees. It came through the specific gap, not anywhere else along the tree line, that specific opening." "That's the natural passage from the north drainage," Will said. "Natural for someone who knows this land, or for anything that's been through that gap before. Have you seen tracks there before?" Will thought about it. He had been running that north drainage his whole life, working the timber, checking the fence lines. He had seen deer tracks and coyote tracks and the various animal records that a working farm's adjacent woodland produced. He thought about whether he had seen human tracks in the gap before the December morning. He said, "Not that I noticed." "Not that you noticed," Margaret repeated. The distinction was not accusatory. It was simply the distinction between what had been observed and what might have been happening unobserved, and the Hollow found the distinction worth sitting with. The Holts continued to live in the farmhouse. This was noted without comment. It was their house, their land, and there was no practical reason to leave a sound building on a productive farm because of footprints in the snow. Jonas continued to work the farm, and Clara continued to run the household, and Will continued to work alongside his father, and life in the valley continued in its ordinary December rhythm. But Will began checking the yard before first light. Not dramatically, not with a lantern and a weapon, not with the specific preparation of a man expecting trouble. He simply woke early enough to be at the window before the light came, and he looked at the yard. He did this every morning of that December and every morning of that January, and he saw nothing unusual. The snow that fell in January fell evenly and was undisturbed. The yard was the yard. He kept checking. Nothing happened again that winter. The spring came and the snow went and the yard was muddy, and then dry, and then summer firm, and the season passed in its ordinary way, and the farm was productive, and the Hollow was the Hollow, and the account of the December prince receded into the background of daily life, the way unresolved things receded. Not forgotten, but no longer in the foreground, present as a piece of knowledge rather than a piece of concern. Jonas wrote it in his farm journal. He kept a practical record: weather, planting dates, yields, the ordinary accounting of a working farm. And on the page for December 3rd, 1874, he wrote, "Footprints in the yard, leading from the north gap to the porch steps, no return tracks, snow undisturbed otherwise. All three of us in the house all night, nothing heard. Elias Cord examined, no explanation found. He wrote it in the same hand and at the same size as the weather notes around it, treating it as farm information alongside the frost dates and the grain prices. He checked the yard every morning through the winter and recorded nothing further. Will's checking was different from his father's. Jonas was methodical. He went to the window at first light, assessed the yard, noted what was present or absent, went about his day. Will was less systematic. He found himself going to the window at odd hours, the last thing before he slept, sometimes in the middle of the night when something woke him, first thing when he came in from the barn. He was not looking for anything specific. He was just checking. He thought about the course correction. He thought about it more than any other element of the December morning, more than the unmarked porch, steps, or the long stride length, or the absence of any return track. The course correction was the thing he turned over most often in the quiet hours. A course correction required two things: an awareness of the current position and an awareness of the destination. Both of those at the same time, in the dark, in a yard the size of theirs. He thought about what kind of thing could maintain that awareness. He did not find a comfortable answer. He stopped looking for one. The following December, on the morning of December 9th, 1875, Jonas Holt came out at first light and found footprints in the snow. They came from the north gap. They crossed the yard in a straight line, the same line, or as near to it as he could judge, the same course through the open ground with the slight leftward adjustment at the midpoint. They came to the porch steps. They stopped. He stood in the yard and looked at the line of prints, and looked at the porch steps, and looked at the tree line, and looked at the porch steps again. He went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Clara came in from the other room. She looked at his face. He said, "Again." She went to the window and looked at the yard. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she put the kettle on the stove, and they waited for the water to boil, and Jonas went back out to look at the prints in the better light, and the morning continued. Elias Cord came when Will rode to fetch him, the same as the year before. He walked the prints the same way he had walked them the previous year, from tree line to porch, at the full length, examining individual impressions, checking the surrounding snow for any return path. He stood at the porch steps for a long time. "Same stride," he said. Measured it. Jonas had already done this. "Same spacing, 2.5 feet. Same gap in the trees. Yes. No return. Nothing. I walked the perimeter before I sent Will for you." Elias put his boot on the lowest step. Soft pine, clear impression. He looked at the unmarked porch boards. "December 9th, he said. "Yes. Last year was December 3rd. He turned this over. 6 days difference. I noticed. Not the same date. No." They stood at the porch steps and looked at the prints crossing the yard, and looked at the tree line and said nothing for a while. Then Elias said, "It's going to come back." Not a question. Jonas looked at the yard. "Yes," he said. "I think so. Every year. Or not every year. We don't know yet. 2 years now." 2 years, Jonas said. Same direction, same destination, different night. He paused. I've been trying to figure out what it's coming for. Elias looked at him. The porch steps, Jonas said. Every time. It stops at the porch steps. Doesn't go further. Doesn't leave. He looked at the last impression in the snow. The clear boot-shaped depression at the base of the steps. It comes to the door and stops. And you're all inside. All three of us, all night. Nothing heard. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, have you thought about opening the door? Jonas looked at him. Next time, Elias said. When it comes, if you hear it, open the door. Jonas looked at the porch steps, and then at the tree line, and then back at the porch. I don't hear it, he said. That's the thing. I've been listening for 3 years now, since I started watching the yard before light. I don't hear anything. No. Whatever it is, it moves without sound. He looked at the gap in the tree line. Or we don't hear the sound it makes. They stood in the yard and held the account, and the morning passed around them, cold and clear. Elias Cord wrote about the Holt prints, both years, in a letter to his brother in the East County who had an interest in such matters. He wrote it carefully, the way he had examined. The prints, factual, sequential, without embellishment. He described the impressions, the stride measurement, the course correction, the gap in the tree line, the unmarked porch steps, the absence of any return path. He described the hollow's investigation and the absence of a satisfactory explanation. He described the second appearance of the prints a year later, on a different night in the same month, following the same line. He wrote, I have no account for what made these prints. I have eliminated the explanations I can think of: an animal, a person passing through, a trick of the snow's surface, and I have found each elimination supported by the evidence. The prints are consistent with a person walking and inconsistent with a person being present in the yard, because a person present in the yard would have left. The prints came and did not leave, and that is the complete physical record. He wrote, what stays with me is the course correction, a bearing adjustment in the middle of a dark yard at night, across ground that showed no landmark to adjust by, returning to a precise line that ended at a precise destination. This is behavior I associate with intention and familiarity. Whatever crossed that yard had done it before, or had formed an intention about doing it, and it executed that intention without error. He wrote, the Holts remain on the farm. Jonas keeps the farm journal. The prints have appeared twice. Whether they will appear again, I cannot say. I can say that when I stand at the porch steps and look at the gap in the tree line, the distance between them feels shorter than it is. He wrote, it comes to the door and stops. I don't know what it wants. I'm not certain it wants anything, in the way a person wants things. I'm not certain it is a person. I'm not certain it is not. He wrote, the snow tells you what it saw. It doesn't tell you what it means. He sealed the letter and sent it south with the next courier, and his brother wrote back 2 months later, saying he had shared the account with a man of his acquaintance who had spent time documenting unusual events in the Ozark Ridge country. And the man had said he had heard of 2 similar accounts from other valleys. Prints arriving but never leaving, always in winter, always at a threshold. He said the man had no explanation either. Elias filed this in the part of his mind that held things he could not do anything with, and continued living his life in the ordinary way, which included checking on the Holts in December and examining any prints that appeared in their yard with the same careful attention he had brought to the first appearance. The second year, standing again at the porch steps with Jonas beside him, he had said, It's going to come back. He had said this because the pattern was 2 points now, and the 2 points defined a line, and the line pointed toward a third occurrence and a fourth, and however many followed. He had been right. He continued to be right. The prince appeared a third time in December of 1876. Jonas found them on the 14th, 2 weeks later in the month than the second appearance, 11 days later than the first. He noted the date in his journal with the same level notation he used for everything, December 14th, 1876. Prince in the yard again. Same line, same stride, same endpoint, same unmarked steps. He had been watching every morning. He had not seen them arrive. He stood at the porch steps and looked at the last impression, and he thought about what Elias had said 2 years before about opening the door. He had thought about this often. He had thought about what he would find, or not find, if he opened the door when the prints were being made, in whatever hour of the night or early morning they were made. He had thought about what it would mean to stand in the doorway of his own house and look out at his own yard and see whatever was crossing it. He had not heard it arrive in 3 years of watching. He went inside. He told Clara, "Third time." She came to the window and looked at the yard. "December 14th, she said. 3rd, 5th, 9th. No pattern I can find." "No." She stood at the window for a while. Then she said, "It hasn't done anything." "No. 3 years. It comes to the porch. Stops. Leaves no return track. Doesn't do anything." "No." She turned from the window. "Then I'm going to stop being unsettled by it." Jonas looked at her. "I'm not saying ignore it," she said. "Keep recording it. It's worth recording. But I've been unsettled for 3 years, and it hasn't done anything, and I'm going to stop." She looked back at the yard once more. "Whatever it is, it comes to the door, and it doesn't knock. I can live with that." Jonas stood with this for a moment. He thought about what it said about Clara, that she could arrive at that decision and hold it. He had been trying to arrive at a similar position for 3 years and had not managed it. He kept watching the yard. He kept sitting up at the table longer than he needed to in December evenings, listening for a sound that never came. He said, "I'm going to keep watching." "I know you will. It doesn't bother you." "It bothers me," she said. "I just decided that being bothered by something that hasn't done anything and may never do anything is a waste. I'd rather be bothered by things that have consequences." He thought about this for the rest of that December. He thought it was probably the right approach. He did not manage to adopt it. He kept watching. He kept recording. He watched every December morning for the following 4 years and found the prints 3 more times: 1877, 1879, 1880. Always in December, always on different dates within the month, always the same line from the same gap in the tree line to the same porch steps. Always no return. Always no sound. Always the porch steps unmarked, the impression of intent arriving at the threshold and going no further. Will was a grown man working his own section of the farm by the last appearance in 1880, and he had been watching December mornings for 6 years by then. He had never seen the prince arrive. He had never been awake at the right moment or in the right room or facing the right window. He had found them the morning after, the way his father found them, already made, already finished, the event completed before any of them had a chance to witness it. He wrote about it once, in a letter to a friend in the East County. "The thing that bothers me most is not what it is. It's that it's been coming here for 6 years, and I've never seen it arrive. I watch every morning, every December. I've never caught it. Whatever it does between the time the snow stops and the time the light comes, and in that window I am either asleep or looking somewhere else, and it completes its visit and leaves. Or doesn't leave, rather, which is the other thing. And the morning shows me only that it was there. He wrote, "It comes. It doesn't leave. I don't know where it goes." Those three things are all I have, and 6 years hasn't changed them. They followed the footprints, but they never led away. 6 times across 7 years, the prints came from the north gap and crossed the yard in a line that bent slightly at the midpoint and arrived at the Holt porch steps and ended. 6 times the snow held the evidence of an arrival without a departure. 6 times Jonas Holt stood in his yard at first light and read the record that the snow kept and found it saying the same thing. Something came here in the night. It knew where it was going. It came to the door. It pressed slightly deeper at the midpoint, as though the effort of the crossing cost something at the center of it. It did not knock. It did not enter. And then the account ended, because the snow ended, and the morning continued, and the farm had its work to do. Jonas Holt never heard it arrive. In 30-odd years of December mornings, the years he remained on that farm, watching, he was never at the window at the right moment. He was always elsewhere, or asleep, or facing the wrong direction, and the prints were always already made when he found them. Present and finished and done, the event over before it could be witnessed, leaving only the record. The record said, "It came." The record said, "It did not leave." And on every December morning when the snow had fallen clean in the night and Jonas came out at first light and looked at the yard and found it unmarked, he stood for a moment in the still cold and looked at the gap in the tree line and thought about what that meant. An unmarked yard could mean many things. It could mean the night had been quiet and nothing had passed. It could mean the conditions were wrong. No snow, no surface to hold the record. It could also mean it had come and gone through the snow, and he had not found the prints yet. Or that it had come and he would not find them where he was looking. He always checked the porch steps last. Jonas wrote it all down. The journal survived. The farm survived. The Holt family was on that land for another 20 years before the sons married out, and the property changed hands, and the farmhouse eventually fell to the ordinary entropy of an uninhabited structure. By then, everyone who had stood in that yard and read those prints was gone, and what they had seen was what the journal said they had seen, and the journal said it plainly. The prints came and did not leave, and no one in the house heard them arrive, and the course correction at the midpoint was specific and deliberate, and the stride was long. And at the base of the porch steps, season after season, the last impression lay clean in the snow, always the clearest of the 18, sharper at the edges than the ones before it, as though whatever made it had been most present at the moment, it stopped, only of having been there, only of having come. Commutales, stories from the edges of the recorded world,